I'm delighted to continue our afternoon session now with two long-term associates of PEFM, Francisco Torres and Russell Kincaid. I'll briefly repeat the introduction for Francisco, although I think almost everybody here heard it before. Francisco is...
They're all the same.
They're not all the same.
I know.
There's at least three people who are not the same.
But they don't care so much.
So the three people, the rest can switch off for a minute. Because you've heard it before. So
Francisco is that boring guy that was presenting.
That's right, he's back again, but you've got Russell first. Francisco has a master's degrees in economics from the Catholic University of Lisbon, PhD in European Political Economy from the University of Lisbon, MA International Affairs from Johns Hopkins. At the moment, he's the visiting senior fellow in European Political Economy at the European Institute of the LSE, senior member of St. Anthony's and PEFM Associates, and visiting associate professor at New University in Lisbon, and on the EU Steering Committee of the European Consortium for Policy Research. Russell, I have known since 1993, I think, and we worked together on Bulgaria in the late 1990s. So Russell is a long-term IMF member and worked a lot in Eastern Europe, and Europe, I mean, is relevant for this building. Also, I mean, finished his career as director of the Office of Internal Audit, so working out the risk management and control and governance processes at the IMF. Both Russell and Francisco are close friends and associates of Max, and so this is a very worthy continuation of the book discussion we had before. I think to give Francisco a bit more of a rest, Russell will start. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Charles. I'm going to try to present what I have termed a transatlantic perspective, that is a U.S. perspective. I will say this is probably what I would term a U.S. perspective pre-Trump. So I am not at all advertising that these views represent the views of the incoming administration in any way. So I'll start with that disclaimer. The first point I want to make is that Brexit economically, it may be a big issue for Great Britain in terms of lost output. The IMF sees it anywhere between 1.5% to 4.5% of GDP over a 5-year period as a sustained loss. The IMF has done the same calculations, and those are available here for the EU as a whole. The aggregate number is not there, and I'll tell you why. It's zero at the beginning, and maybe in the extreme scenario they get it up to 0.5% of GDP, and you can round down to zero if you want. But like many things, the distribution of that is very different within the euro area and within the EU, as this table shows, giving both what they call their limited or central scenario and the adverse, which is, they don't call it that, but sometimes it's referred to as the hard Brexit. So, first of all, the implication for the EU, this is not a big deal. Here's a perspective from Brexit from the US. I just picked two more quotable ones. Krugman, which I would consider a bit more on the left, Martin Feldstein a bit more on the right. But you could, there are people further to their left and further to the right that have equal opinions. But one common element in this, where Krugman says remain, Feldstein was arguing the opposite. Both of them have a problem with the functionality of the EU. And part of the question is, would it be better to fix it inside or outside? And some in the United States administration certainly felt, from a U.S. perspective, it would be better if the UK remained within the EU because there would be a better chance for reform of the EU. And not talking about what was best for Great Britain. Now, so Brexit, from this perspective, is more a political issue than an economic issue. The EU is a club. And like all clubs that people join or leave, you know, there's a cost-benefit analysis between the cost of being in and what you gain from that, and the various production costs of being the member. The theory of clubs, you know, is Buchanan. There's a long literature here. What is interesting and also true, you don't have to be a member of all elements of a club. Yes, the UK was in the EU, but it wasn't in the Schengen area. It had an opt-out for the Eurozone. It didn't join the single supervisory mechanism. You can join many clubs, and clubs can have overlapping memberships. So you don't necessarily have to buy into all elements of a club. One of the points that I will be making as this presentation goes along is that the challenges facing the EU and the Eurozone in particular aren't not going to change materially by Brexit. Those solutions are not easy, and some of the discussion that took place in the context of your book, Francisco, you know, went into some of the challenges that are confronting the euro, and I'm not going to deal with them now, but we might later in the question and answer session. And the decision-making processes within the Eurozone and the EU more broadly are still cumbersome. Those are the major problems facing the EU, not Brexit. And one of the worries, I think, on my side of the Atlantic is that the EU is going to be distracted by having to negotiate Brexit through the Commission with the 27 other members, rather than getting around to the more serious business of dealing with its own internal challenges. And that is probably the bigger risk. Just a bit of a reminder, probably not necessary for this audience, but I've given this presentation in the US where the details of the Europe structure are less well known. The key one is, of course, an ever closer union amongst the peoples of Europe, the need to establish a single stable currency, and the next one is to respect the equality of member states as well as their national identities and so on. As you will see here, some of those concepts are vague, and some of them are actually not wholly consistent with one another. This is a quote from one political economist, scientist, and talking about the fact that the definitions are unclear. What is ever closer union? Is it the United States of Europe, as was discussed earlier? Is it something less than that? How much less than that? What is the ultimate ambition there? We've heard about this incremental approach to achieving what ultimate end, though? When does that incremental process conclude? I think there's not agreement on that at all, and that's part of the process. Equality of treatment of members. Well, that's another issue. Certainly, the Euro crisis has put that to a test in terms of how the periphery countries have been treated by the core. Now, The European project, and this is the view presented by many, both on my side of the Atlantic, but here as well, has been driven by the elites. It's a top-down approach, to use, I think, the phrase you, Francisco, presented earlier. And as a consequence, there's been a democratic deficit. This projects relied on what's been called output legitimacy, that is, achieving economic gains, maybe not just economic, peace, security. And this has been what's been termed a permissive consensus, sort of the silent majority going along with what the elite has put up forward. This came to an end, in the view of Hug and Marx, to U.S. professors with Maastricht, and then continued with the failed Constitution. And now what they say exists is a constraining dissensus. That is, the European elites look for solutions that avoid going to the people with a referendum, that avoid going to parliaments, that avoid basically more democratic input, in part a concern that they'll get an answer that they don't want to hear. Okay. The question for this audience is, has the EU fallen prey to overreach? It started with 12 countries. It started with 6 countries in 1957 with the communities, went to 12 countries with Maastricht. After that, it grew to what is now 28. There are 5 countries that are potential EU candidates. The most interesting one for these purposes, of course, is Turkey, and what's going to be done both from an economic and political security standpoint. There are 2 other countries that are potential candidates in the Balkans. And then you have the European neighborhood policy that has identified 5 European countries, and here I picked this because Ukraine is amongst them, that the EU wants to achieve the closest possible political association, the greatest possible degree of economic integration. I'm not sure what that means exactly. If you took closest possible political and greatest possible degree of economic, that would be EU membership and Euro membership, literally. Though I'm not quite sure that is the way that drafting is met. Again, this enlargement has made the European effort more heterogeneous in a number of ways: language, ethnicities, cultures, religion, complicating cohesion, which is a club issue. Economically, which is what I have focused on here, is that there are 6 EU countries, mainly in Eastern Europe, but also in the Balkans, Bulgaria being one, where their per capita incomes are substantially less than 1/3 of what is the core, the 6 original EU members. Now, the Bundesbank has looked at what has been accomplished within the EU in terms of economic convergence. And basically it said that it cannot find anything that has happened in terms of economic convergence that isn't explained by more general economic factors. That is, if they were outside of the EU, they would have grown faster than the EU. Being in this club didn't add anything. And in particular, the authors conclude that the structural cohesion funds and the whole accession process that they went through didn't contribute anything to closing that gap. with the EU as a whole, and that the Euro group is not a club in that sense. That club didn't work any differently, but there are regional clubs. That is, there are parts of Eastern Europe that collectively have grown very similarly, though at a rate that will not reach the EU level in any time in the foreseeable future. And the same with the Balkans, a separate lower rate. So there are clubs. They are driven by geography. They are not driven by other factors. Now, the conclusion these authors come to is the EU needs to think about what it's going to do in terms of future enlargement. And they don't say it, I will say what fundamentally needs to be done. You need to think about why this process of accession didn't work in these previous cases. And basically it involved a lot of laws, a box-ticking exercise in my estimation, and not really asking the question, have these laws been effectively implemented, which is some of the issues that evolved in the context of Greece. Laws were passed, but secondary legislation not passed, then not implemented by the bureaucracy. Is the structural reforms that are needed to have a optimal currency area, to have a system that works well, is it working on the ground? Have you achieved meaningful success? And then decision making is more difficult when you have more heterogeneous groupings. They disagree on what the objectives are, the time frames. Part of this reason the EU has moved from unanimity decisions to qualified majorities in some cases, but still in a number of issues it's unanimity. That's a problem. Within the Eurozone, they've gone to intergovernmental arrangements outside the community process of the treaty. This is done, again, because they couldn't get everybody to agree. It's a desire to avoid problems. And with the Lisbon Treaty, you added explicitly the possibility of, well, I can exit the club, because in my estimation, the cost-benefit analysis has shifted such that exit is the solution. And you can also exit the euro, at least in the view of the German Minister of Finance, where you might be given a timeout for a period of years so that you can get your, let me use a colloquialism, get your act together. And then after that period of time, you could be invited back into the euro at a different exchange rate than you had before, and with different fundamentals. Okay, now, I think everyone understands that Brexit is not Grexit. It's going to be a lot easier for Great Britain and a lot easier for the EU as well for this transformation to take place. Now, decision making, will it be made simpler? Yes, Great Britain has had a loud voice. 13% of the vote is significant. But on most Euro matters, Britain's been silent. So whatever the Euro club needed to do, it could do on its own. On security issues, it's NATO that matters. And if you look at the Eurozone as a whole, they have a qualified majority, even now. So for decisions that are required with a qualified majority, the Eurogroup could go ahead even if the UK vetoed it. I think one of the fundamental issues in this story is, does everybody in the EU still want to be in the euro? And I'll come back to what later public opinion polls show. But I think there's a real question about whether the outs want to be in, particularly in the wake of the euro crisis. But if you're out in the of the euro, but in the EU, are you a second-class citizen? You know, do the Eurogroup members make a decision, and you're left with a fait accompli? How friendly is the EU in a governance sense for those who are not buying into the whole practice? Okay, I won't go into the economic issues behind the challenges to the euro, which have to do with the endogeneity of the OCA conditions, the optimal currency conditions. But just to say that there's no evidence that euro membership has made those group of countries more homogeneous, and that it is working in a way that the problems will go away on their own from an economic point of view. Most recently, Dolores, in terms of his own views and part of a larger project at the Dolores Institute, has said the euro came to stand on uneven legs. When it tried to run, it nearly fell. It was plain for everyone to see. In its present form, the euro is not viable in the long run. And this comes from one of the founding fathers of the euro. Now, to be fair, he has a list of things that needs to be done and proposals to fix the euro. Okay. In the earlier session, we have Europe began as an elitist project. That's Dolores. We have the statement by Monet that basically justifies the democratic deficit. The elites will construct this new Europe. Then people will see the practical benefits, and then there will be validation afterwards. But one of the problems that probably was not foreseen is that people who don't have a say then don't say. People don't vote in the European parliamentary elections as they do in their national parliaments. And voting in the European parliamentary election has steadily declined election after election. So people are, I was going to say voting with their feet, but they're actually not voting with their feet. And the most recent Eurobarometer survey shows that more than half of the EU respondents disagree with the statement, "My voice counts in the EU." People don't feel ownership of this process. Now, part of the real problem is that the process hasn't delivered its output legitimacy. It hasn't delivered on making people's lives better. It's made some people's lives better. Economic integration, globalization is output enhancing as a whole. Just as structural reforms may be output enhancing. But there are two problems. One, we've already discussed time frame. It may be in the future. But there's another problem which was not discussed, which is you can change relative prices within the society between not only capital and labor, but also different stratas of labor. And the process, and this is basic trade theory, Stopler-Samuelson, if you want to know, or Heckscher-Ohlin, is that low-skilled workers in a high-skilled society are made worse off when you open and have more trade with low wage countries. And there are lots of studies that show that in-country income inequality in the EU, and I could say the same thing about the United States and other countries as well, has increased. And within the EU, most of that inequality is explained by in-country worsening of equality. So income inequality has worsened in Italy or the UK. At the same time, the periphery countries have grown faster, and the income inequality from, say, Bulgaria and Romania, that gap with the rest of the EU has reduced. So there is gains. There is some reduction of income inequality across countries, but within countries you get a lot more tension. And this is not only a tension that is worker elite, but it is also regional. You know, here would be London versus the Midlands or whatever. In the United States, it's the coasts versus the Rust Belt. And you know, if you look at a map of voting in the United States, the red is the center of the country in the South, and the blue or Democratic are the two coasts. And so it maps very closely to both inequality issues, but also, you know, who is benefited from trade liberalization and structural reforms in the United States. Now, it is possible to deal with this problem if you redistribute and tax the gainers, and you make transfers and benefits to those who here are losers. The problem is that hasn't happened. And in that sense, the political bargain between the elites and everybody else hasn't been fulfilled. It's an open question whether that can change. There's another issue. It's not only the economy. There's an issue of identity. An identity, in this sense, is described as a sense of mutual obligation or solidarity. Okay? If we share an identity, I'm willing to help you out if your house is on fire, or you know, you have an accident, you know, and you do it as a gift. Okay? There is solidarity. Now, you can have multiple of those attachments. You can be, in a national sense, you can be a Scot, a UK, and an EU, and you can have attachments to varying degrees to each of those. And you can have attachments that are religiously based or ethnically based. But the real problem is that, based on Eurobarometer surveys, people do not identify with the euro or the Europe or the EU as strongly as they identify with their national economies and national countries. And look at the issue of the Germans providing assistance to the Greeks. That's a transfer, but it's one that they're not willing to do. Meanwhile, the Germans transferred many billions to Eastern Germany to unite Eastern Germany. So there's a different, you know, but they did that because they're a German country. These are our brothers. I mean, and it was divided after the Second World War. They were reunited and more than happy to spend huge amounts of their tax dollars to help each other out. Germans are willing to help for solidarity reasons, preserve the euro, but there's a limit to that. And you know, this national identity issue can get ugly in some elements, but it's an important constraint on trying to have an ever closer union. Now, one of the interesting outcomes is that those countries that are in the euro, the people there want to stay in the euro. And that may well be they find the benefits of being in more than the costs of leaving. So there's an asymmetry. Once you're in, leaving is expensive. So you're happy to stay in, and it's not clear how you get transfers if you are in trouble, at least if you're a small country, and not clear if you're large. But if you're outside the euro, more than half of those respondents to the Euro Barometer think that euro adoption would be a negative for their country and don't want to get into the euro, even though they're obligated in all cases. So you have this interesting asymmetry. If you're out, you want to stay out. If you're in, you want to stay in. Now, it's sort of an American perspective. The American identity was not formed overnight. First you had the Economies that had a confederacy, much like what exists economically here in the EU. It moved to a federal system with a central government with the U.S. Constitution. But we had a civil war. 11 states left the Union. Now, if they had left the Union and hadn't attacked federal forts, we might now have two countries in the geographical area of the United States. That's a very interesting thesis that some historians have put forward. But when the South left the Union, officers in the U.S. Army left from the South. They joined to fight for their states. They joined states' militia. It's state rights. So they identified more with states than with the country itself. From certainly a Southern perspective, the Union Army occupied the South until the end of Reconstruction in 1877. And the U.S. really only started to have an identity after the waves of immigration in the 1880s, which came to an end in 1914 with the First World War, and then with the great migration of Afro-Americans out of the South into the rest of the country, which, for better or for worse, there are a lot of tensions from that process that are revealed in the U.S. Elections. But you now have a much more homogeneous country, but it's homogeneous in the sense of being ethnically diverse. It's spread out all over the place. So the lesson I would suggest that one needs to draw from creating what is called e pluribus Europa is that it's a long, prolonged, and difficult process to have a national identity that is European, and to have an identity that would allow one to create the political structures to have a federal system in Europe, which may also be a necessary condition for a sustained Europe. So that basically are the same conclusions. I would advocate, therefore, you need to be patient, but you have to recognize that these political constraints, you need to fix the euro. I think that we would, but that task is both politically difficult, it's economically difficult, and it's going to take a long time. Enlargement of the EU, thinks needs to be put off for some time, and you need to think of how to make that process work when it starts again. And there is a need for a serious debate on what is the size of Europe and what is actually meant by ever closer union. Where is this project going? Is it going to the United States of Europe or somewhere else? Does everybody have to join the euro? I mean, why not have a system, say, like NAFTA, where you have free trade, but you have floating exchange rates, you have sovereign countries, but you don't have a single labor market. Then you need to make every integration process work for everybody, something that has not been done. And then finally, a much more democratic process, one that goes to the voters and listens and makes the arguments so they have ownership in the outcome and not driven from the top. You want to switch
Shall
seats?
I move? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And now for the counterpoint.
Not necessarily, but is this one? No.
You could
It
do
would
a
not
better
be.
job.
Where is the thing to put it?
That's Brexit and the future of European Union.
Yeah.
That's it.
Where is the?
Oh,
I see it down. Yeah.
So,
No,
No,
no.
it's,
Just to put it in the.
oh,
oh, I see.
or F5.
What?
F5.
F5.
Yeah,
This one F.
up here.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yes. The same is not a transatlantic perspective. Whatever.
Continental.
Right here. Okay. Maybe starting to be provocative. There we go. There's one person that called for the referendum. This was he's sitting there on top of the lion. And in fact, what is funny in the British debate is that people then after we were here, right, and people started to complain. But the problem with the leader of the Labour Party,
Corbyn.
Mr. Corbyn, he didn't do enough. I said, yeah, but certainly he didn't call the referendum in the first place. Of course, he voted even for no in 75, right? So he's been more consistent. Or now with the problem with Theresa May or Boris Johnson and so on, basically people are criticizing Boris Johnson and Corbyn. But in fact, it was the Conservatives for internal reasons, for party reasons, that convoked the referendum. So there we are. Or if you were even more puzzling, why are you leaving? I mean, if you cannot get a better situation, you were inside without many of the obligations. But that goes back to the beginning, right? When we decided to create the EEC, the European Economic Community. In fact, we created two different clubs because the United Kingdom didn't want to join political club. And that is why when Russell was just saying why not having NAFTA with free floating exchange rates and diversified labor markets and so on, because the idea was to create a political club. And this was from the very beginning, and that is why the United Kingdom said no, we don't want to be part of a political club. So they decided to form EFTA, right, the European Free Trade Association, with the Nordic countries, which had an interest because they had, this idea of neutrality. Austria and Switzerland as well, Portugal as well, because long-term partner of the United Kingdom, and because of some internal problems with democracy, and the colonies as well. So this idea of creating a market with their own colonies, Britain with the Commonwealth. So there were different interests there, and these were not compatible with a political union or ever closer union as the EC was from the very beginning, is in the Treaty of Rome. So it was created a different club. Now, this didn't work because one was a free trade area and the other one was a customs union and a common market. From the very beginning, the idea was there. So this is politics, because in the sense if you create a common market, is what became the internal market, you have politics, majority voting, regulation, and so on. And therefore, you are not just in the first stage of integration. This is basically Bella Balassa with a little bit adapted. It didn't talk about economic and monetary union, just economic union, and we go to political union. But we're moving, but from the very beginning, you aim at political union, because only with political union or some kind of political union you can make a common market to work, right? And in fact, it took long. The custom union was very fast and was achieved even 6 months before time, but the common market didn't work, and you needed to have this idea of 1992 and go to majority voting and have a step forward in terms of political unity. So you have here two models of integration, one which is based on ever closer union, the other one just a free trade area. The United Kingdom chooses to stay outside, but then when it's decided to go for a common market and you see that the things are working, 1 year later, in 1961, the UK asks to join the European Economic Community, right? So you have two models, two European models of preferential liberalization which compete. One as a customs union and the other free trade area, and obviously the benefits of having larger market scale, common external tariff, which results in force of inclusion because of trade diversion for the others, right? Reinforced by enlargement, leads the UK to ask to join in 1961, followed by Denmark, Norway, and Ireland. Then Norway decided not to join. Of course, then de Gaulle said twice.
And Greenland decided to exit
From Norway, from Denmark. So you have to wait a little bit because
and from the European community.
From
yeah, well, yeah, when Denmark joins,
the
Yeah.
official
Greenland stays
Out.
and now you have this case Norway, Greenland, and now Iceland that asked to join, and then at the last minute said, well, we don't want to join anymore.
Yeah.
So you have these cases of very specific countries. But then the UK decided, well, it's not in our interest to stay outside. In fact, in a paper I wrote with Annette on Brexit, we have this quote from the Yes Minister series, right? And she's very good to watch because they say, well, we don't want to join, but we have to join to impede that it works, right? So we have to stay inside, so to impede that it develops into political union, so it stays at the free trade level, so to speak. So the idea is there all the time. And so you have this first domino effect, right? Some EFTA countries abandon the club and join, and the remaining EFTA countries sign a bilateral free trade agreement with the EC. This was resulted in these type of circles, right? Overlapping circles. You have Spain and Greece still outside, Portugal already with a free trade agreement with the EC because remember EFTA, the other EFTA countries as well, and the UK, Ireland, and Denmark inside the European Economic Community, 9 member states. And an evolving customs union aiming at a common market, but not proceeding very fast for a common market. But then you have a second domino effect, because the creation of the European Economic Area, which extends the single market to the EFTA countries, the fourth enlargement to Austria, Sweden, and Finland, EFTA is left with 4 very small member states. And in fact, it is very funny that Norway, which is now a big state in the EFTA countries, said, well, during the Brexit debate, we are saying, yes, you should go out and so, but once now there was talks of choosing the Norway model, the Norwegians said immediately, no, we don't want the UK here. Please no, because it's obviously an enormous country, too big a country to come to small EFTA, right?
Mm-hmm.
With completely, I mean, Norway would be lost there. Very tiny country, Liechtenstein and so on. So only these tiny countries stayed in EFTA and the others joined, so this is the second domino effect. And this is the nature of force of inclusion towards regulated, regulation-based advantage. Abolition of frictional barriers to trade, liberalization of internal market, grows in importance with the view of competitiveness, decrease internal common tariff, etc., etc. This, in fact, is very similar to what this idea of having TTIP or CETA, right? Is to have a regulation-based advantage of being inside. Although TTIP and CETA are more making the market and not so much regulating the market. And that makes a difference and creates opposition, because if you're just making the market among heterogeneous countries, obviously, because of this inequality issue, you don't want to be a member of the club necessarily. Or you risk to lose more to be a member of the club. The heterogeneous costs are higher. The Eurozone club started with 11 members, then Greece joined, and then all the others. You see the periphery started to join after the center joined from the very beginning, together with Finland, and then all the other countries join. The Schengen area, you have 26 current members. Is the EU members minus the UK and Ireland, which are not members. Ireland basically because the UK is not a member. Cyprus and Bulgaria, Romania and Croatia because they are still not ready, but eventually they will become members. And even 4 EFTA countries, Iceland, Norway, Switzerland and Liechtenstein are members of Schengen, but the UK is not a member. And if you look at participation of EU member states, Eurozone and not, in intergovernmental agreements to reinforce EMU, you see that UK participates in none of them. So this has been, in fact, in terms of solidarity, identity, shows that there's not much identity with a crisis or with suffering periphery crisis here in the UK, in the sense the UK government made clear that it had nothing to do with the crisis, would not help out in Greece. Although being here is very funny because even the financial press was very much close to, say, Syriza positions, which is left-wing government in Greece. And this is the financial press in the United States and the UK. They say, yes, you should not have so much austerity, you should help out Greece, but they do not contribute, right? They say, yeah, but the Germans should pay, or the others. Eventually, I mean, Italy is paying a big deal of this helping out, and other countries, poorer countries like Slovakia, Slovenia, and so on, which resent very much the behavior of Greece in many respects, or the Syriza government of Greece in the last 2 years. So you see the euro area as these countries, then you have the Euro Plus Pact, which have Bulgaria, Denmark, Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Sweden are part of the fiscal compact, and the Czech Republic, Croatia, HR is Croatia, are part of the SRM, and the UK is part of none, right? Doesn't participate in anything. So we're just discussing, I mean, the regulatory area under the control of the ECB is smaller than the single market, so in financial services, so the UK has been able to benefit from that, and it had privileged access to the European Central Bank liquidity operations during the global financial crisis, and the regulation of oversight of central bank counterparties, presently done joined by the ECB and the Bank of England, meant that high proportion of euro-dominated financial activities, clearing of euros in London, from which the City of London benefits. And the UK government already, I was just discussing with Stuart in tea time, put the ECB in court because the ECB wanted to control the entire jurisdiction in clearing, and it won. But obviously, with Brexit, the ECB will take it back and say, no more clearing than in London. Now, differentiated integration. Yeah, you can have. There are many clubs, as you can see. This is a very interesting piece done by this Valentin Krelinger at the Jacques Delors Institute, and puts together all these clubs, right? Patent, divorce, Euro area, Pact, Schengen, EMU, whatever. You have all the clubs there. And only 6 countries are members of everything. Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Portugal, and Slovenia.
If you reinforce cooperation.
Sorry?
Yeah,
these are taking patent and divorce are reinforced cooperations. This idea that some members could progress, could go further without waiting for the others. If there's a majority, some requisites, they go.
Multi-speed Europe.
Yeah, multi-speed Europe. It works there in paper, so it's a very nice slide. Yeah, I think Europe doesn't work like this. Cannot work. Or possibly this reinforced cooperation is good for divorce or good for patent as a transition. You don't agree because of in patent, for instance, the Spaniards and the Italians are out because it was not translated into Spanish or Italian, just that. So in divorce, I mean, there are different traditions. Sweden and Malta, I think, oppose very much the divorce reinforced cooperation. But these are small things that you can cope with within the union. But other things, core things, like the internal market, and I would argue EMU, the euro, cannot be put at stake. So in a way, and I will come to that, right? So this is a model that is very confusing. It works in the sense, yes, you can be no member of Schengen, no member of the euro, but then it shows up in conflict later on, right? Schengen, I mean, this first reaction because of terrorism and so how to control it, external border, or you are preoccupied, so you just isolate the country and you don't let anybody come from the continent or whatever. So it's bound to have problems. The euro the same, right? Why? Because in order to sustain the euro, we have to have an economic union that is not a standalone economic union, but an economic union with the properties to sustain a common currency, without which the internal market will not work because of competitive devaluations and so on. That was the fear with the crisis in 92, 93, right? They said that's why the countries said, well, we cannot work like this. Even common agriculture policy would not work at that time. And that was the idea of the exchange rate mechanism and so on. So you have to have stability. Of course, you can say, well, but the United Kingdom was out, and this derogation, this opting out, is all very well, it got it. And in fact was free riding from the system. There was stable currency in the continent, in the internal market, and the pound could fluctuate a little bit, but was a huge benefit for the UK to have stable currency prices in the rest of Europe. And okay, even funding is very little in Europe. We don't have a budget like the United States, just 1% roughly of GDP, and is very regressive, right? There's no progressivity at all. Rich countries pay less per capita, or the same basically than poor countries. With the rebates, the UK is the country that pays less, in fact, and it makes it and makes a big thing of that, of the rebate. You need a rebate because we are net importers and so on. So that creates problems when you discuss the budget, and we have all seen the former Prime Minister of the UK very strongly combating the idea that he had to put more money because of rebalancing the budget and so on, just before the vote of the Brexit vote, right, 6 months before or so. Now, coming to the theory of clubs, I put it a bit more, I'll go back to that, but has been just hinted at. You have benefits of integration that arise from the coordination and centralization of policies. We have economies of scale, and you have heterogeneity costs arising from the loss of independent policy making, right? So these are the costs and benefits. Economies of scale are obvious even in defense, for instance. If you said that you had NATO, and that would not make any difference if the UK left, but in fact it might make a difference if the rest of Europe wants to go on with some joint defense policy and the United States will step aside, as it happens to be the case, with a policy of saying, well, let the Europeans discuss defense, and we put less resources in. I hope it's not. It's not. It's still not. It's yours. And so it has a lot to do with economies of scale, in fact, because one of us, in any case, is if you have just one European army or competent border control in Schengen or so, this has a lot to do with benefits and economies of scale, instead of many different armies with no budget whatsoever, no capacity, efficiency at the European level. And but of course you have benefits of having discretionary policies and flexibility that you lose when you join a club, right? The point is that what is the mix between, what is the equilibrium? What do you choose? And when you increase the number of members of the club, the very function of EMU will impact on all those criteria. So you have an optimum number of countries that are members of the club, EMU or the EU. Let's take, for instance, 22 are the optimal level of EU members, right? And if you have 12, you should enlarge the club. Why? Because the marginal benefits are higher than the marginal costs. So at the margin, if one member more comes, it has benefits for all. Accrued benefits to the club and for the country. But after 22, the next member will just increase heterogeneity costs and is bad for everybody. So it's better not to let anybody else in. Close the club at, say, 22. So there's an optimal level for the club to work, EMU and EU, and we discussed that before. Yes, But obviously, there are a number of political problems here. You don't want to expel countries. But eventually, yes, countries will decide by themselves that the costs are higher than the benefits and it's not worthwhile to stay in. And they will swap with other countries that are not members and will join. But what I say is that there's an impact of policies. So depending on policies, these lines shift, right? If you have adequate policies, output legitimacy, you might create a better union for all. And so the number of members would be larger. Or you integrate so much that it's more difficult that the benefits will be large enough to compensate the costs for most countries that are in. So as you deepen the EU, you go more and more towards political integration, it's more difficult to cope with heterogeneity and heterogeneity costs, right? And so it was easier for the United Kingdom to be inside, say, in the first years. It became more and more difficult with the internal market, although the United Kingdom was the big promoter, and in fact, we benefited a lot from that in promoting the internal market. But then, as the internal market took place, and you had more regulated based in Brussels directives and so on, it became more unbearable for the United Kingdom, and probably more reasons to leave. With the EMU even more, right? Economic and Monetary Union. Before that, I think the big difference here is that what I would go further than Russell on looking at this theory of clubs is that economic and monetary union really became, since Maastricht, although there was an opting out for the UK and for Denmark, the core of EU political integration. Because you need one money, one market, one money, and therefore for the internal market to function you need monetary union. For monetary union to function you need a complete economic union. Now you see with the crisis even more. And therefore you cannot have any more differentiated integration in the EU. You can have patents and divorce, yes, these reinforced corporations in minor issues, but you have to have a strong core, a cohesive EU for it to deliver. If not, it has no output legitimacy. And there are many examples. I mean, many things the EU wanted to move on, it did not, because the UK would just simply veto, because it would not feel comfortable in moving on to a deeper stage of integration. But the others would like to move on. So there's a conflict there. And when you have such a conflict, it's better probably to separate. It's like better amicable divorce or to live in hell together in the same house, right? And in that, I think the Brexit vote created a new Europe. You have a new paradigm now. If a country wants to leave, nobody will stop it to leave. Countries that do not feel well will even be encouraged to leave, to enact Article 50. So, well, it's probably to be better out, Euro as well, Eurozone or the EU. That gives much more degree of freedom to the EU to go on in completing the economic union, the economic side of economic and monetary union, and to pursue and deepen European integration. Schengen, migration policies, defense policy, and completing banking union and so on. This is not easy. I mean, and the problems will not go away because we don't have a UK veto. No, of course. I mean, the problems are there. Right? It's not, but in fact, will be more homogeneous and easier to decide on many things. Why? Because it's less differentiated, less heterogeneous. And in a way, there's a higher chance of agreeing in many other aspects that on which the UK did not agree. Now, the entire debate of Brexit is now obviously, I mean, I think, by the way, if you made this referendum, as you did in the UK, in any other country, the risk of having exit is relatively high everywhere. I mean, once you have the referendum, people just vote for a number of reasons, right? You could say that many people here voted Brexit because of internal inequalities, London. So they've voted against the London bankers, and not against, but London bankers is Brussels is the same, right? Technocrats and so on. And people just mix up everything, like the French voted against the Polish plumber, and they voted against the constitutional treaty that had nothing to do with the Bolkestein directive. So people are angered and they vote against. Or they vote for Trump as a protest against the system, or they vote for Grillo against the system, or in Austria they vote for candidates, both of them, the current president and the other one are completely out of the system, right? The established parties disappear totally. People just want change. They are angered at a number of things. And what I believe they are angered at is not to do so much with austerity or with the faults of the euro. And it's very interesting that if you look at opinion polls, there's a huge majority, 2/3, right, that are happy in the euro. And these in the adjustment countries, in Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain. They're happy. They want to stay with the euro. And obviously the ones that have not experienced the euro and see all this mess going on, there's a euro crisis, they don't want to join because they say, well, we live relatively well because the Central and Eastern European countries are doing relatively well. They were catching up and so on. Why should we go into problems once we know the status quo? Although recent countries that have joined, Latvia, Lithuania, and so on, Estonia, are perfectly happy now in the euro, right? They joined, they took the decision. Once they decide, they are happy inside. So this is a puzzling situation. But I think it has to do a lot with what you gain, what you think you gain, or you lose inside the club. And this has less to do, in my mind, in my opinion, less with austerity and with the euro fragilities that we have to solve and are not solved yet, but more with the perils and uncertainties of globalization. Because it affects all countries in the world, being Latin America, North America, Europe, and so on. So people are very not satisfied at all with the way democracy works now at the national level. And by the way, if you look at this democratic deficit question, people are as dissatisfied with the EU as they are, in some cases even more, with the national politics. If you ask a Greek or a Portuguese, well, an Italian, but even, before, I don't know the situation now, a British, they would say, do you trust European institutions? Well, in Britain, they would not trust European institutions, as we could guess, but they would trust even less British institutions. In fact, they asked for Parliament, so they didn't trust Westminster at all. Now, the Nordic countries would tend to trust more national institutions than European institutions, and the southern countries much more European institutions than national institutions. So you can understand the idea why to join the euro. In fact, I almost go back probably in the discussion to a slide I look for. I was in a conference in honor of Mike Artis. I don't know if you know him or you knew him, from Manchester, and he had made a facial representation of the optimal currency area criteria. It's very funny. I'll come to it. But the southern countries, in fact, joined the euro not because they were mad or totally ignorant. Joined. If you made an opinion poll, they were strongly in favor. Why? Because they hoped to change the domestic institutions for the better. They were used to governments that inflated the economy, used exchange rate policy for domestic politics, and so on. And they were fed up with that and losing money. And, all these countries had the IMF there instead of the Troika before. So
Greece did?
Huh?
Greece did?
Greece did as well, no?
When?
No.
Greece
No.
didn't.
No.
Greece didn't.
No.
This is the only exception. Italy
Ireland?
had... Ireland, no, but... Well, had Britain, Portugal, and Italy, right? Clear this case had the IMF here with standby agreements. So, in the case of Portugal and Greece, they certainly knew what was to live with the devaluing currencies, right? And that's why they were strongly in favor of the euro. And it seems they, in spite of austerity, there's this other element that I think you mentioned, that once you have a banking crisis or so, you might want to have the safety net. So you are inside, you don't want to walk outside now in the middle of the crisis as well. That is true. But so this resentment, this feeling of not being well in the EU and EMU has a lot to do with uncertainty towards globalization, the future, and so on. And that's why I think, going back to CETA and TTIP, it seems that will never happen now, because if President Trump says that TIP is over, right, which was the first one, this will all be finished. And even CETA was strongly modified by this opposition from the region of Wallonie in Belgium. So if you look at it, I'm not sure that will be even ratified by all parliaments, and if so, it's still in the interest of Canada or in other European countries. Was certainly now in the interest of the UK, because going out of the EU would have, if there was an agreement, there was CETA or TTIP, right? Automatically the UK would benefit, and for a trade agreement was interesting, but is much more akin to the way of thinking of the UK than the rest of continental Europe. And I would argue that part of the opposition, when people say, now you can, if there's Brexit, there will be Frexit and so on, Marine Le Pen will argue the same and say, let's go out, because I'm not completely sure. Because she was more against this type of trade agreements. Bouvet, this French agriculture leader, is very much against this. It represents this, let's protect France and our cheese and whatever and our culture against Hollywood and so. And they're not against austerity. They want to have a more continental model of European integration. And that is why it's very puzzling that the Commission wants, let's deal with this and sign these treaties without discussing where do we want to go. Because a crisis is important for this. I mean, yes, we are the model, ever closer union, but among whom and to go where? What is political union? Very vague. Yes, remains an open model. You go on together. But if you don't know the direction, then you have a problem, right? If you know more or less the direction because you want to build on your type of model society that you had before, that is basically the Rhine model with some add-ups, right? Some flexicurity, whatever components. And by the way, this model lost to the kind of Anglo-Saxon model relatively recently, without proving that was really much worse, right? But it is viewed in most continental Europe that, yes, was the Anglo-Saxon model that won its way. And so Europe, the internal market and liberalization, trade liberalization and so on, was basically done in the model of, led by the United Kingdom, basically, or by American interests. And not exactly by what was the tradition in French or German politics or Italian politics, much more protectionist and so on. So you have to watch out these developments. The world is changing not only in Europe but outside, but possibly we have to evolve having a discussion what is the model of European integration we have, and if that model is compatible with the preference of the current member states. And if not, some member states will say, well, it's not worthwhile to stay, but others might join and so on. So I always look at European integration, and in fact, because of Brexit now, the European Institute at the LSE, probably the same discussion here, said, well, how are you going to sell our program? We have a European Institute, master program and so on. Who is going to study Europe if you have Brexit? And say, well, because here we study European integration and disintegration, right? So it's an ever-evolving process. It's an open process. The club might shrink. It has been enlarging all the time, but might shrink now and then enlarge in the future, and until you reach an optimal level. And that, together with what's happening in the world with different regional integration schemes and so on. So, of course, there are different preferences here, right? All these countries, what they want is free movement, right? And now is completely opposite of the preoccupations showed in the Brexit vote. You want to counter this free movement of people, EU workers. And the funny thing is that the Blair government that accelerated the free movement of workers, right? Because there was this transitional period, and in my view, I think they did well. But now it is the British that are saying we don't want this free movement. We want to be out because this is too fast, and we have problems that we cannot pay for all these guys coming from all the other EU countries. So we are showing here different preferences. This you can leave for the discussion, but it's just steps of leaving the European Union. And of course, not for this informed audience, but in the public debate, to just say we have to negotiate this trade agreement and to stay with this and that, and in the model, stay in the internal market and not. I mean, there's nothing to be negotiated now. Once you choose to be out, is out. There's nothing to be negotiated. To be negotiated is that who is going to pay the pensions of the British functionary in the Commission? Who is going to pay the salaries of people that are still working for the European agencies? Who is going to pay for the projects that we started together and now we have to divide it because the project is not anymore a European project? So this is very small practicalities, nothing to do with grand arrangements that can only be arranged and discussed after the UK has left the EU, basically. Obviously, politically, we'll start to discuss, envisage, and so on, but I think it will be very difficult to discuss anything concrete, even not only between the UK and the EU, but between the UK and the United States. Even there, the United States will look, I mean, let's wait and see, what are you going, where do you want to go, what do you want? There are certain things that Europe will want back to Europe, but the United States may want back to the States, right? Things that it lost before to London or so. So this will be a long process and with another result, but obviously it can work very well. I mean, one has to be positive. Let's say that we can be very good neighbors. I mean, what's the difference, say, for continental Europeans like me that come here and enjoy life in the UK? We come, we have to show the passport. Well, I do it already, you know. You have to change your currency, euros for pounds. I do it already. So nothing really will change in that sense. You can even be free of this idea of being dragged by the European Union to ever closer political union and say, well, we are just neighbors and good neighbors, so let's do our best to have the best deals for all parts involved, and so no problem.